Okay, so we're here to learn for a few minutes an introduction to the Rambam's Moreh Nevukhim. It's a very formidable undertaking because so much has been said and been written about the Rambam's Moreh Nevukhim. And so, by way of introduction, let's just get our bearings on the Rambam and his approach to a lot of different ways of thinking in his life. He writes a number of very important works, as we know. The three most important works that the Rambam wrote were his Perush HaMishnayos, were his commentary to the Mishnah. Are you having trouble hearing me? Is that the... Okay. The three commentaries, or the three works that the Rambam wrote that were most important, he wrote many other works, but the most important works that the Rambam wrote were, number one, his Perush HaMishnayos, number two, his Mishnah Torah, and number three, the Moreh Nevukhim. His commentary on the Mishnah, which is what he wrote as a young man, the Mishnah Torah he wrote as a middle-aged man, and the Moreh Nevukhim he wrote towards the end of his life in the 1190s. The Rambam is born around the year 1135, and he dies around the year 1204. And the Moreh Nevukhim was written in Arabic, and the reason, therefore, why the official language of this class is English is because I don't find it purposeful to read a text that is already translated into another language and then have to break our teeth on it. So what we're going to be using as our primary text is the edition that was published in the early 60s by the University of Chicago by Professor Shlomo Pines, which is a very authoritative translation, and some say that there's been nothing really since then that has been as effective of a translation directly from the Arabic into English. As we'll see, the reason why the Rambam wrote this book was as a response to a student. We're going to see that in the introduction itself, but we're probably not going to have a chance to begin the introduction today because I really want to frame what the whole function, what the Rambam's project, as it were, was in writing this work. As we'll see, because it wasn't translated into Hebrew until the Rambam had already passed away in 1204, he was able to sort of live out the remainder of his life relatively safe. But once the Moreh Nevukhim was translated into Hebrew and it became available, it became circulated, it created a tremendous amount of controversy for reasons that we'll be discussing over the course of our introduction. To describe the Rambam's project, it has been described in a number of different ways. Many people think that the Rambam's work, Moreh Nevukhim, is a book on Jewish philosophy. But most people who take it, delve into it more carefully, actually come to the conclusion that it's not about philosophy at all. And really, in order for us to, sometimes we'll say flippantly, oh, it's Jewish philosophy. But the question for the Rambam is there such a thing as Jewish philosophy? And what is the word philosophy? What does it even mean? So I'm going to put that aside for just a minute. Let me give you the following mashal. Let me give you the following analogy. Let's say there was a rabbi that started to give a series of lectures and write a series of books. And the whole project of this series of lectures was to try to point out to us that Chazal had a very secretive way of communicating information that is contemporary. In other words, we know in the 20th century, we know about physics, we know about traditional Newtonian physics, we know about quantum physics, we know about tremendous advances in technology, we know about astrophysics, we know a lot about our physical universe that it would seem that Chazal could never have possibly known about. Well, what if a person were to come along today and to tell us, I can show you that Chazal actually knew everything that we know today and even more, and I'm going to demonstrate to you how they knew this by showing you texts in traditional Torah shebichtav and Torah sheba'al peh that will demonstrate that they knew exactly what we know today, and they knew even more. Well, we would say, well, what's the price for this kind of project? In other words, what does that cost? So the answer is that what it's going to cost is it's going to require us to look at texts that we had grown up with and always viewed in a certain way and reinterpret them in another way. But the reinterpretation is not far-fetched, and indeed, that's what Chazal meant all the time, or that's what the Pasuk meant all the time. If we were to be eager to buy into that project, that might be a price that we were willing to pay. But it does come at that cost, that it does require a certain amount of reinterpretation. The Rambam's favorite pasuk, when it comes to approaching aspects of esotericism or certain things that are really latent or hidden underneath the surface of both texts in the Tanakh and texts in Torah Sheba'al Peh, it's a pasuk in Mishlei in Perek Chaf Hei, which you don't have in front of you, and it says as follows: Tapuchei zahav b'maskuyos kesef, davar davur al ofnav. That when you have golden apples in silver spokes, this is a matter that is spoken on its proper way. And what Chazal, the way Chazal interpret that pasuk is that there used to be certain artwork in the ancient and medieval world, and it still exists even today, where you could take a wheel that has silver spokes, and behind the spokes you have golden ornaments, like golden apples or golden artwork. And the only way that you can see the golden artwork is when the wheel is spinning and the spokes, I'm sure like you've seen, if you ever drive in the hood, you see these very fancy hubcaps that spin, right? And when they spin, they show you something that you hadn't seen if the hubcap was stationary. Well, that goes back to the ancient world. And there's a certain type of artistry that requires a certain amount of craftsmanship to be able to conceal that which is behind the spokes, and you can only see it at certain times when the wheel is spinning. For the Rambam, this is what one of the projects that Chazal had, in that they exposed certain aspects of Torah, and they were craftsmen at hiding other aspects of the Torah that were not meant for the general populace, because they could be abused if they were just made available to the general public or subject to misinterpretation. So sometimes we call this Sisrei Torah when we talk about Kabbalistic work, but the Rambam's Sisrei Torah are what he said. Essentially, what it boils down to are the ideas that are the contemporary ideas of his time. So, what do I mean by the contemporary ideas of his time? Today we have Newtonian physics, we have quantum physics, we have astrophysics, we have knowledge of the atom and all of the different parts, atomic particles. In the Rambam's time, the science of its day was Aristotelianism. And I don't say Aristotle because the Rambam, in all likelihood, never studied Aristotle's original texts in their original Greek. But because he lived in Arabic lands, the Arab world was extremely scholastic and had inherited a vast number of Greek texts, translated them into Arabic, and also used all of the meforshim, all of the commentaries to those Greek philosophical texts, and refined and enhanced those texts. Those are the texts that came to the Rambam. As a matter of fact, in different places, the Rambam attributes a lot of the wisdom that he presents to his readers based on the philosophers, the Arabic philosophers of his time. The two philosophers that had the greatest impression on the Rambam was a 9th century Arabic philosopher named Muhammad al-Farabi, and then the other one was, I believe, an 11th century named Ibn Sina, or Avicenna. So those were the two that made the most important impact on the Rambam's thinking. But here's the important thing that we have to understand, is that the Rambam felt that anything that was true about the Aristotelianism of his time had already been, this was really part of Torah. It was passed down as an esoteric tradition, meaning that it was not communicated widely. It was never written down. But it is part of our oral tradition. All of the things that Aristotelians profess to know about the universe today, the science, the physics, the metaphysics, all of that was known to Chazal, but they deliberately embedded it with their intellectual craftsmanship so that it would not be exposed to the public. There are two disciplines within these Sisrei Torah that the Rambam will regularly make reference to it and makes reference to them in his introduction. And it is based on the first Mishnah of the second chapter of Maseches Chagiga, which is what you have in front of you. So let's take a look very briefly at that Mishnah. And I'll just read, most of the texts that we're going to be studying are going to be, we're just going to do it in plain English, but we'll just do the Mishnah in Hebrew first. The Mishnah says, Ein dorshin ba'arayos bishlosha, velo b'maaseh v'reishis bishnayim, velo b'merkava b'yachid. A person may not teach a group of students that are 3 or more matters of sexual halacha, the arayos. And as the Rambam explains, the reason why you can't teach 3 or more people the laws of the arayos is because you might have a group of 3 students or more, and one student asks a question. The Rebbe focuses attention on that one student. The other 2 students break away, and they start having a separate conversation, a sidebar. They miss out on a vital piece of information in halacha about the laws of arayos, and we're worried that chunks and vital chunks of necessary halacha about the arayos will not be imparted to all of the students, and therefore great destructive behavior may ensue as a result. So therefore, when it comes to transmitting the laws of the arayos, one has to be very careful to make sure that the students hear every single word, because the arayos are things that people tend to rationalize to themselves, this is okay or that's okay. So that's the first law. We cannot expound, that's not germane to what we're going to be talking about today, but the next 2 are, V'lo b'maseh v'reishis v'shnayim v'lo b'merkava b'yachid. You're not allowed to expound on the act of creation to 2 or more students, and you're not allowed to expound upon the act of the chariot to 1 or more students, unless that one student who was studying under you the law of the vision of the chariot is wise and may understand it of his own. In other words, he already is coming to the table with a certain amount of experience and knowledge. Then you're allowed to take that student under your wing and teach him further the vision of the chariot. What is the vision of the chariot? Well, that in itself requires a definition. Simply put, it's an expounding upon the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel, which we read as a Haftorah on the first day of Shavuos. Many of you may not remember that Haftorah, because if you stay up all night, it's the Haftorah that you sleep through, right? But it's the vision of the chariot, where Yecheskel describes the Godhead, as it were, as it's known in certain types of literature. It's sort of describing different aspects of visions that Yecheskel has to describe that which is beneath Hashem, or his manifestation to this world. Okay? So, what are these 2 things? Ma'aseh Bereshis and Ma'aseh Merkava. They seem to be things that are very important, but they have nothing to do with Jewish law like the laws of arayos do. And the question therefore is, why may I not expound upon these things in very open and overt ways? Why must I limit myself when it comes to the act of creation to only 2 students or less, and when it comes to the Ma'aseh Merkava, 1 student or less, 1 student, right? And that student has to be himself someone who is already wise. Well, the Mishnah continues, and it gives us sort of an inkling of what it has in mind. Kol hamistakel b'arba dvarim, anyone who gazes at four things. Really, when it says gazes, what it means is that a person introspects and sort of meditates upon the following four things. Ra'ui lo ki'ilu lo bala olam, is worthy of never having come into the world. Ma lamaila, ma lamata, ma lefanim, ma le'achor. What is above, what is below, what is ahead, and what is behind. Meaning, you're not allowed to meditate as a human being on aspects of reality that are not meant for the human intellect to delve into, simply because they transcend a three-dimensional, or actually four-dimensional, 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. If you try to transcend and extend yourself, extend your thinking beyond certain parameters of thought, you're worthy of never having been brought into the world, because basically Hashem says, that's not what I planned for you to engage in. Certain aspects of reality are not meant for the human mind to engage in, and therefore you're going too far. And that really, so what's the connection between the previous statement and over here? This gives us an idea that the reason why Chazal wanted certain types of esoteric teachings that are very difficult to grasp and sort of go to the border of those parameters that Chazal say you're not allowed to transcend, we really don't want you to delve into, because they are subject to misinterpretation. And when you go past certain parameters, you are going into dangerous territory, which could lead you astray, at least intellectually, to misunderstand what's going on in reality. And that could cause you to leave your belief in Hashem the way that Hashem wants you to believe in Him. And it could therefore cause you to leave Torah observance, ultimately. And that's really what Chazal are trying to communicate to us, is that there is a certain kind of reality that Hashem wanted us to work with, which is the physical world. There are things beyond the physical world which change completely our orientation and understanding of God that could potentially lead us away from Torah observance, and therefore you're not supposed to go there. Now, the Rambam is going to have his own interpretation of what Maisa Bereshis and Maisa Merkava are. And this is what I think what we're going to do today is, just for the purposes of our studies today, try and understand how the Rambam understands Maisa Bereshis and Maisa Merkava. The Rambam explains these two terms in the 3 main works that I mentioned to you: his Perush HaMishnayos, the Mishnah Torah, and in the Moreh Nevukhim. By the way, I should just add parenthetically, there are many people who, when they look at the Mishnah Torah and they look at the Moreh Nevukhim, they seem to be from 2 different authors. The Mishnah Torah professes fealty to the Torah and to the Torah alone. The Moreh Nevukhim seems to try and reconcile Aristotelianism with Judaism. It's almost like a totally different type mentality, but they are exactly the same person. And it's quite clear when we're going to study some sections from the Mishnah Torah itself, where the Rambam addresses Maaseh Bereshis and Maaseh Merkava, and as you'll see, this is exactly the project that he has for Moreh Nevukhim. So, and which sort of leads some of the commentaries to say that whereas the Mishnah Torah is the Rambam's exposition and interpretation of the halachic aspects of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, his Moreh Nevukhim is an exposition and explanation of the Agadic portions of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which means that the Rambam feels that embedded within the Agadic portions of Torah Sheba'al Peh are contained the true scientific nature of all that exists in the world, both about God and His universe. So let's take a look what the Rambam says. In source number 2 in his commentary, and I just didn't have this text in English to provide for you, so we'll read it. This originally was written in Arabic as well, but this is a very good translation of it. And he says as follows: Ushma mimeni, ani, ma shenitbayer li lefi da'ati, mima she'iyanti bo midivrei chachamim. I want you to listen to me. because I'm going to share with you what has become clear to me after having delved into the words of the sages, what exactly these terms mean. V'hu shehem mechanim b'ma'asei v'reishis l'mada'ei hateva v'hamechkar b'reishit ha'biriyah. That the term ma'asei v'reishit that you find in this Mishnah is the term that our sages used to understand scientific knowledge and an understanding of the history of creation. So that's the first phrase, ma'aseh v'reishit, that we have to have clear. It means scientific inquiry and an understanding of how God created the world. That's what ma'aseh v'reishit means. So, if you want to learn physics, if you want to learn chemistry, if you want to learn zoology, biology, all of this is under the rubric of Ma'aseh V'Reishit. V'kavanatam b'Ma'aseh Merkava Hamada Ha'eloki. What do the sages mean when they say the word Ma'aseh Merkava, the act of the chariot, or the vision of the chariot? This is scientific inquiry of God himself. A scientific analysis of God. V'hu hadibur al klalot hamitziut, which really is a general discussion of existence in general. V'al mitziut haborei, the existence of God. V'da'ato, and what it means for God to have knowledge. Uta arav, and all of the descriptions that we ascribe to Hashem, what each description means. V'chiyuv hanimtzaim mimenu, and the necessity of all that emanates from God. V'hamalachim, v'hanefesh, v'haseichel hadavek ba'adam. It's also a discussion of angels, the soul, and the intellect that attach themselves to man. Uma sha'acharei hamavet, and that which exists in the afterlife. All of those are discussions of Ma'aseh Merkava. So, Ma'aseh V'Reishit is an analysis of the natural world. Ma'aseh Merkava is an analysis of the supernatural world, that which is outside the physical, that we can quantify in the laboratory. To put it another way, and this is really the language of the Rambam itself, because this is the world that he lives in Aristotelian terminology, Ma'aseh V'Reishit is physics, but we mean Aristotelian physics, not Newtonian or quantum physics, but Aristotelian physics, which we'll see what that is when we get into the Mishnah Torah. And Ma'aseh Merkava is metaphysics, which is an analysis of that which exists above the natural order of the planet Earth, but rather which exists in the celestial realm, in the divine realm, in the afterlife realm. Okay, so those are the two studies that the Rambam says are what the sages say are very important, but because of their esoteric nature, and they go towards those parameters that we talked about before of human inquiry, a person has to be very careful. Umachmat chashivut shnei hamadaim halalu hativ'i v'ha'eloki uvetzedek hechashivum, that because they are so important, these two disciplines, both physical science, physics, and metaphysics, the knowledge of God, and the sages justifiably elevated their status. Hishiru milalamdam kishar hamadaim halimudiyim. Our sages exhorted us not to treat them like other disciplines of knowledge. V'yadua shekol adam b'tivo mishtokek l'chol hamadaim bein shuhu tipesho chacham. As is well known, every human being tries to delve into different areas of knowledge. That's the human condition. We are curious. We try to find out what's going on. And our curiosity exists whether a person is foolish or wise. Many people are very foolish and they're very, very curious. Curiosity killed the cat, right? So just because you're curious doesn't mean you're smart about your curiosity. So therefore, v'iyafshar la'adam shelo yachshov b'shnei hamadaim ha'elu b'iyun rishon. It is not appropriate, not even possible, for a person who's a beginner to try and delve into these two very advanced disciplines. Umashlit machashato aleihem beli sheyu lo hakdamot v'lo nichnas b'shlavei hamada. And it's not possible for really a person to wrap his head around these ideas unless he has had proper preparation and has gone from, Physics 101 to the more advanced physics, Metaphysics 101 to the more advanced metaphysics. Lefichach mona mizeh v'hizhir al kol. And therefore, the Mishnah tells us you must be very careful and don't expound upon this publicly. Now, if I were to tell you that the Rambam does that very thing that the Mishnah says that you're not supposed to do, that the Rambam goes ahead and does expound on Maaseh V'Reshit and Maaseh Merkava, and that indeed is one way of framing the entire project of the Moreh Nevukhim, we would have a dilemma, because then it would seem that the Rambam is in violation of a halacha of the Mishnah. So how would we respond to that? Well, it's not just the Moreh Nevukhim that expounds upon Maaseh V'Reshit and Maaseh Merkava. As I'm going to show you next time, the first 4 chapters of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, which is his magnum opus on Jewish law, is dedicated to explaining Maaseh V'Reshit and Maaseh Merkava, which is in itself bizarre. A work of halacha that the Rambam set out to explain all that is in the halachic framework, the exposed Torah, the halachic parts of Torah Shebaal Peh. The Rambam devotes the first 4 chapters in Hilchot Yisodei HaTorah to the esoteric ideas of Maaseh V'Reshit and Maaseh Merkava, which had no bearing at all on our halachic lives. Why did he do that? So it's really two questions. How could he violate the Mishnah's precept that you're not supposed to share this publicly? And number 2, what is it doing in the Mishnah Torah? So those are things that Mirz Hashem will have to think about the next time we get together next Monday. In the meantime, I want to just find out, are there any questions here? Because we've covered a lot, sort of like some of the introductory material. Are there any questions just about the terminology, any definitions that I wasn't clear about, or any other questions that you have? Binyamin.
Does anybody sort of chart how the first, like Ezekiel's vision, how it fits in the sort of definition of the Rambam that it's talking about? These very specific things like life after death, and in other words, he says that's what he's talking about, but how, like.
The Rambam himself will devote a certain small portion of Moreh Nevukhim to a breakdown of the first chapter of Yecheskel, not a significant amount. So he doesn't, I don't know that there's any, it could be that there are those who break it down that way. But you should know that the Rambam is unique in his interpretation of Maaseh Merkava as meaning metaphysics. If you look at the other Meforshim on the Mishnah, they take the Rambam to task. And they say that this has to do with visionary kinds of Sisrei Torah. In other words, what the Kabbalistic, delving into areas of Jewish mysticism that have nothing to do with Aristotelianism. This relates to the Gemara in Chagiga that is on this Mishnah, talks about the Pardes. The Pardes, the orchard, the Arba Shenichnasu LaPardes, the 4 that entered into the orchard. So the Rambam says that this is 4 who entered into philosophical speculation because they delved into those areas of study, but they went too far in their delving into those areas of Aristotelian study. But all the other Meforshim, Rashi and all of the others, say that it has to do with out-of-body experience that is described in some of the more mystical midrashim that we have.
It's very specific about Ezekiel's vision, but Yeshaya also had a vision in...
Yeshaya also has a vision.
And he doesn't refer to that. And they seem to be similar visions in terms of...
Right, so it could be that Maaseh Merkava may refer to a series of visions that have to do with the angels and God. Doesn't necessarily have to limit itself to the first chapter of Ezekiel. Okay.
It could have been there. The Rambam could have gone further, but restrained himself to answer your question. Your question is like, why would he expound on something that you're not supposed to expound on? Could it not have been that he knew more than he wrote about? That he could have gone a lot further, but
yes.
kept himself under control.
Precisely. Yeah. I agree with you, Howard. There are certain aspects of Maisa Bereshis and Maisa Merkava that, according to the Rambam, we're all allowed to discuss. And that's not something that is limited to one student or two students, and that's ultimately the way we're going to answer the question. Yeah.
Aristotelian physics is embedded in Chazal and the Torah, and subsequently it's proven to be incorrect. So what does that mean?
That's a great question, and that's something that is worth focusing on separately. We'll talk about that later. Okay. Have a great